got it for her.
Oh, look at that fluffer.
Look at his teeth.
Oh, perfect for Halloween.
He says, I'm a good boy. I just don't like other dogs because I was around so many of them and now they all freak me out.
Aw.
Look at this guy.
He was rescued from a hoarder house.
Oh. That face.
He's so cute.
Take your costume, Debbie.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I thought about doing my full-on Ray costume, which I've done to teach before, but I have a meeting with the Vice President for Academic Affairs later today, and I didn't know if he would think I was taking it seriously if I did that. But I did wear my Halloween shirt for y'all, so.
At work today, I'm wearing a onesie and going as a Beanie Baby.
Nice.
Oh, that's cute.
No,
I fell into crap in the 90s.
we have a lot of dogs in cones right now, so I bought a bunch of colorful duct tape so that I could make them into different things. And I made one of them into a Beanie Baby. His name is Courage. He needs he's a huge dog. He's like 100 and something pounds. And he's still just a baby. And he's going to be in a cone long term, and he keeps destroying them because he just runs into stuff. And so we duct taped them to give them a little bit more like. And this time I taped it all white, and then I made a heart out of red duct tape, and then out of white duct tape I made a TY.
So cute. It's Friday. People are being a little slow getting on, but that's okay. We have time.
It took everything I had to get out of bed this morning. I had to like yell at myself basically to get out of bed.
Yeah, I
Same.
have alarms set for like half hours apart, and I slept through my first 2 this morning. And the only reason I woke up after that is because Quinn woke me up. So
Yeah, I have to do a couple further apart, and then as it gets closer to when I actually need to get up, like I do even more, and I have progressively more loud and obnoxious alarm tones. But yeah, I still slept. The last one is what woke me up today.
See,
had
I'm
too many
awake,
animals.
but I'm not out of bed yet.
that's completely understandable and totally acceptable.
Yeah, Fridays I'm always definitely going to be in class because I'm at work, and so I'm already for sure awake.
Nice. Well, actually, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you all about today. Is I realized when I redid the syllabus, taking away fall break, I kind of didn't pay attention to how long my lectures actually are. So what I should have done was extended learning theory, as we figured out last class. But what I did was extend this lecture, which if you've taken a look is only 17 slides. So I don't need 2 days to go over that. Even if we have some spillover, I can easily do it quickly before our discussion on Monday. So here is my proposal. So we'll have class today, we'll have class Monday. Your exam will still be a week from today, but I'm gonna give you Wednesday off. And it'll be the day after the election, so everybody needs time to recuperate. And you can use that time to study or sleep.
That would be so dope.
Yeah, and I will need it too, to be perfectly honest. So I will actually I'm gonna write myself a sticky so I don't forget. I will send you all an email so you remember, and also so people who aren't here can know that. You are welcome. Yeah, I'm very glad. And yeah, again, you can use that time to work on your take home or just sleep. I'll probably sleep in. Well, I can't because of Quinn, but I'll probably lay back down to be honest. All right, so I'm gonna say 285 evals.
Real quick, my niece wants to say hi. She just had yogurt. So
Bye.
say hi.
A meow.
Yeah, a meow. Good job. She sees Debbie's cat costume.
Yeah, Quinn goes kitty meow. Oh, there's a real kitty meow.
There's my real kitty. She says hi.
You see the kitty?
Yeah.
She's so cute.
She's waving to you.
Is my dog still asleep?
Oh, I don't know where Simba is today. He's ignoring me. I think he finally got over the fact that I'm home all the time. Whatever, human.
No, you can't have it. Okay. Say bye.
Bye.
Okie dokie. All right. So anyone who just signed on, what I was just saying is that I planned things incorrectly and we don't need 3 days to cover this next topic. So we will meet today, we will meet Monday. Your exam will still be a week from Friday, but I'm going to give you Wednesday off. So you can use that time however you need it. Is Wednesday what day will that be? 4th? Does that
That's
sound
the fourth. Yeah, that's the fourth.
Alrighty, so I am going to get our PowerPoint being a PowerPoint and makes it sound like our PowerPoint has an identity crisis. It does not. Alrighty, and I will send an email to remind you all of what day that is. So let me go ahead and get myself set up here. There we go. And I'll go ahead and share screen. Get that out of my way so I don't run into it because I know I would. Alright, and make sure I have the chat open. Yes, perfect. Thank you for putting the date, Debbie. And for people who were here early, I showed off. I'm wearing my Halloween t-shirt today, so getting a little festive. So today we're going to look at, oh, helps if you could see my face. There we go. Today we're going to look at behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology. And I just have to like do a quick side note and tell you guys a funny story about this section. So one time before the Benton Honors College was the Honors College and it was just honors and scholars, they asked me if a student could sit in on my class, this class. And I was like, sure, yeah, no problem. Not thinking what day it was. And it was the day we were covering this stuff. And I was like talking a lot about sex. And I was like, oh God, she's never going to come. And she was like, that was really interesting after class. And she came and she was one of my advisees. So this lecture holds a weird place in my heart because of that. If anyone knew Emily Caldbeck, well, she was here. That was her. She's the one who did the experiment with the stingrays a couple of years ago. Alrighty. You guys have heard at the beginning of the semester some of my issues with evolutionary psych, especially as influenced by Newberry. But we are going to try to keep an open mind. And I will tell you, if you are interested in this, Dr. Martorell in the fall of next year will be teaching evolutionary psych, a whole course on it. If you're a psych major or minor, it counts for that bio section. And I've heard, what's that?
I've taken it. It's pretty rad.
Yeah. And you know, I've heard her lecture and to me, she sells it more than anybody else. You know, like she makes it make sense. A lot of the people who are authors in this area don't really. So what's the difference between these two theories? Well, behavioral genetics deals with the possibility that individual differences in psych are related to genetics, are related to our DNA, are passed down. And this idea has been alive, has been around really since ancient Greece, they started to have the idea that this might be a thing. Evolutionary psychology is aimed at genetic universals. So the idea is, what are the basic genetic conditions of the species? What are the things all humans share in common? And this is already one of the issues I have with it, just as, again, someone who's trained in clinical psychology. It's hard to imagine that, you know, there are actually universals among people, right? So, but again, open mind, right? So behavioral genetics attempts to explain how personality traits that differ among individuals are passed from parent to child and shared by biological relatives. It's not concerned with traits that are the same for everyone, like the need for food and water, right? It's not looking at those basic biological things. The main question here is what you see at the top of your slide. Can genes influence broad patterns of behavior, personality traits? And if so, how? There are controversies surrounding this, associations with eugenics and cloning. So if you're not familiar with the term eugenics, this is the idea that humanity could be improved through selective breeding. So we should not allow certain people to reproduce. To give you context, Hitler loved this idea. So, you know, you already know, not great, right? But there was a big influence of it in the US for years. My women's and gender studies class actually did a couple readings this semester related to this. So Virginia actually had a law in place till the 70s that allowed them to involuntarily sterilize people that were feeble-minded or they thought should not be allowed to be reproduced, essentially. And just recently this year, there was a nurse at a detention facility for immigrants who reported that way more hysterectomies were being done, A, without women's knowledge, and B, than should have been done. So unfortunately, some of these principles might still be happening today. This is a good example of science being used for evil instead of good, right? So it happened in the States. Here there is a Indiana historical marker about their eugenics law. As I mentioned, Virginia had one until not that long ago. But modern research really doesn't care about breeding the best humanity. Yeah, exactly, Romina, you and I were on the same page with the forced hysterectomies. About making the perfect person or whatever. Really, it's flipped now, and we want to understand what's passed down and how as we go through things. So heritability is one of the goals of behavioral genetics. It's similar to any kind of genetic study. So if you're trying to find out, you know, how something like anemia is passed down, right? You would do a similar study to trying to figure out how mental illness, for example, or personality traits might be passed down. So you want to compare similarity in personality between people who are and who are not related, and then people who are related to different degrees. And the assumption is that traits and behaviors influenced by genes should be more similar among more closely related people. So your genes should be more similar among you and your parents, for example, than you and your second cousin thrice removed or whatever, right? So this is usually done by looking at differences in monozygotic or MZ or identical twins, or dizygotic or fraternal, and they're also called DZ twins. So monozygotic means that they came from the same zygote, backing up to basics of, you know, prenatal development. When the sperm and the egg join, their first divisions is just a little clump of cells, and that is a zygote. And it takes a while before that zygote becomes an embryo, and then it takes a while before that embryo becomes a fetus. And obviously it takes until the fetus is born for it to become a baby, right? So what happens with monozygotic twins is that zygote splits early on and becomes two zygotes, Okay, so they have identical DNA, barring mutations that happen throughout their lives. And then dizygotic twins are when two eggs meet two sperm. So dizygotic twins, despite sharing a uterus, are no more similar genetically than any other siblings because it's two eggs, two sperm. So these are obviously nice models to look at because the assumption is they were in utero together, they're raised together, so they're probably treated pretty much the same way. So the idea is you can kind of rule out environmental factors and really focus on what might be genetic. The main questions we want answered here are, can the phenotype, which is your observable traits, be attributed to variation in genetic structure or your genotype? So can what we see be attributed to what's in our DNA? And heritability coefficient, or sometimes this is called the heritability quotient, is the percentage of variance of a trait that is actually controlled by genetic factors. So there's a little formula. I'm going to try to type it in the chat for you all. I normally write it on the whiteboard. So where we have R, and I can't do subscripts. So the R here is going to be the heritability coefficient. So the R for MZ twins minus the R for DZ twins. Helps if I use proper capitalization. There we go. Times 2. There we go. So that is the heritability coefficient formula. So when you look at essentially how likely is it that an MZ twin who has a trait, their twin also has it, and then you compare it to the likelihood that one DZ twin has it, the other DZ twin has it, and you multiply by 2, then you get the heritability coefficient. All right, so this gives you, and oh, there's the formula on this slide, so I didn't need to try to type it out, but that's okay. So this gives you an example of how this would be done in a study. And there are studies of twins where there are, thousands of pairs of twins. Like, twins are a thing. I have a friend who has twins, and she was approached like immediately about getting them in studies. Again, because of the shared environment. So you'll see they look at the scores on it, like, again, let's say this is a personality trait, and they compare them. How similar are they? And when you do that, you get a heritability coefficient, or genetic coefficient. It's really just a correlation for any of you who have taken statistics. And so you can get one for identical twins and one for fraternal twins. And again, you calculate that out. And what is on this slide is pretty typical of what we tend to find over and over in these types of studies, that heritability tends to be about 40%. So that means 40% of our traits are determined by genetics, and the other 60% are determined by our environmental influences. And this is really important because even obviously when we're working with twins, their environments aren't exactly shared, right? One was born first, they might have different extracurricular interests. They might, a lot of times they'll end up in different classrooms with different teachers, right? So their environmental experience is still different. So again, the MZ twin average is about 0.6. The DZ twin average is about 0.4, and that ends up being the heritability coefficient, about 0.4. So heritability coefficients, when you look at non-twin studies, are even smaller. They're about 0.2. So it suggests that the effects of genes are interactive and multiplicative, that the more genes you share, the more this is going to be related. And the heritability of adopted siblings who grow up in the same environment but share no genes is only about 5% or 0.05. So obviously there is some genetic influence going on here. So we've got this fancy number. What does that actually tell us, right? Well, it tells us that genes matter, that not all of our personality comes from experience. And it tells us the potential sources or etiology of behavioral or mental disorders. Disorders with very low heritabilities are more likely due to environmental factors. And again, remember, we're looking at so far max of 40% being determined by genes. And this is where I fall back to something I was told in my intro psych class by the man who ended up being my neuropsych professor, which is that genes are expressed in an environment, right? And the best example I can give of this is pretend you have the genes to be 6'4", right? But you're in a place where you're very food insecure, you have inadequate nutrition, right? You might never reach that height. Same thing can happen with psychological things, right? You might have the tendency to be like the kindest, best person ever, but if you're in a horrible situation, that genes might sort of be overcome by the environment. So it does give us also some insights into the effects of the environment on personality development. That the shared family environment may be less important than what happens outside the family. And this is something I repeatedly try to say in my classes, because a lot of times, going back to Freud, right, people try to blame stuff that goes wrong with people on their parents. But like, parents can only control what happens in their house, right? Like, you can be the perfect parent, everything's gender neutral, your kid doesn't have any screen time, and then they walk into Target and there's this giant wall of screens across from the toy section, right? And they all encounter other gendered things, and they'll encounter racist things, right? So the non-shared environment makes a big difference.
I was watching a video last night. There's a girl who escaped from North Korea, and one of the things she was talking about is how, they're very food insecure, and a lot of the soldiers don't get fed. And so many of them barely even reach 4 feet tall because of the environment, because they're not being fed. And so they're not growing the way they should be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You need adequate nutrition. You need an adequate environment to nurture any sort of good personality traits. And you also, need an adequate environment to pull out something like depression, which is going to be our example here, right? So if you have the genes for depression, but your life is generally stress-free, you might never actually have a depressive episode. But if you have a lot of stress in your life, or you experience tragedy or trauma, that's going to come out, right? So genetic causes for depression have been studied in many ways. So family pedigree studies, what they do here is they select what they call a proband. A proband is just the person with the thing you want to study. So in this case, it's depression, right? But you could also imagine it being, a personality trait. Although depression can go personality-ish for sure. These are the people who are the focus of the genetic study, the person who's diagnosed with depression. So if depression is inherited, it should show higher rates in family members, right? And what basic findings from proband studies, from the pedigree studies have found is that as many as 20% of the relatives of the probands are depressed themselves. And the general population, the incident is about 10%. So we're showing higher rates, right? Twin studies here, the MZ twins have higher rates of both having depression than the DZ twins. So again, falling into sort of, 0.4-ish for the MZ twins, 0.2-ish for the DZ twins. Sullivan et al. Did a quantitative review of twin studies. And so they put together data from a bunch of other studies, ended up with 21,000 twins studied when they put all that data together. And they found that MZ twins are twice as likely to develop as DZ twins. So the heritability coefficient, again, somewhere in that 0.4 range. Now, adoption studies, what they do here is that they essentially use probands, but the proband is someone who is adopted. And then they look at their families as well. And then they try to go back and find their genetic relatives and compare that. So in one study, biological parents of adoptees who had been hospitalized for depression had a higher incidence of severe depression than did parents of a control group of non-depressed adoptees. Another study found that depression occurred 7 times more often in biological relatives of severely depressed adoptees than the biological relatives of non-depressed control adoptees. So certainly, even if you're not sharing an environment, the genetic influence is there. And the final thing we've started to get into now is molecular studies, and things like the Human Genome Project have really helped with this. So one of the genes that we found associated with depression is the 5-HTT gene, which is responsible for making serotonin, or 5-HT in the brain. We know that serotonin is linked to feeling good, and when you have low levels of it, or there are problems with transmission between neurons, then that makes you more likely to be depressed. So people who are depressed seem to have an abnormality in their production or absorption of serotonin. There we go. So, does the family matter? Think again about the adoptive sibling heritability rate of 0.05, right? So our extreme conclusion could be like, no, the family doesn't really matter at all. Developmental psychology, though, would tell us, yes, it definitely matters. And the effects of parent training studies. So a lot of studies to treat, or a lot of methods to treat mental illness in kids is actually to train the parents to deal with it. And those show, yes, they make a difference. Just technical issues, yes. Those technical issues are the similarity among adoptive families, and the same culture, being from the same culture as the child you adopted reduces variability. Based on behavioral observations, yes, they do matter. Based on self-reports, no. So in self-reports, people tend to focus more on traits that make them different from others than on their similarities. So how genes affect personality? They create propensities to behave in certain ways. So molecular genetics determines whether differences in traits are correlated with differences in a particular gene. And this is called the association methods. So some of the things they've looked at is homosexuality, for example, being a member of the LGBTQ+ community. So most members of that community within one family had a gene that was distinct from the heterosexual members of their family, if that makes sense. So, and it was on the X chromosome in this case, although one thing I should say is, I'm mentioning the 5-TT gene, I'm mentioning just one gene here. For psychological issues, these are likely multiple genes combining, right, and influence these things. But
Dr. Myers, have you heard about a study that was done on survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants, that they have like a higher propensity for anxiety and depression?
Yeah, and that is called, there's like inherited trauma or something like that. There's also evidence of in members of the African-American community from slavery. Yeah, and it's unclear to us right now whether it's like a gene mutation or whether it's you learn because, if we think about our last chapter, right? You learn by watching your relatives, or probably some combination of the two, to be honest. But yeah, very, very interesting stuff there, that the idea that like the legacy of trauma can be inherited in some way. Behavioral and emotional control is another trait that we've looked at. So this is the ability to inhibit sayings, behaviors that we, probably shouldn't do in certain situations. So this is, again, another specific gene, the DRD4 gene, and it affects the development of dopamine receptors, and therefore how people respond to rewards. And people with too little dopamine or the inability to respond to it may crave stimulation. We can call them sensation seeking, and thus may have less behavioral and emotional control. So neuroticism and depression, there does seem to be, again, this 5-HTT gene, and this is associated with decreased serotonin function, stronger responses in the amygdala to fearful or unpleasant stimuli, how much the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are able to work together. And the amygdala response tends to be stronger among people who have phobias. There are also cultural differences, it seems. So the allele, or part of the gene that is related to neurotic responding, is more common in some cultures. So for some reason in Japan, this seems to be more common than it does in, say, the US or Western Europe. But there are limitations. It's not applicable to everyone. And as I mentioned before, it's not going to be one gene for these complex traits, right? It's a whole bunch of genes interacting. We don't get to do one pretty Mendel square. So how do genes affect personality? Well, there are gene environment interactions. There must be an environment in order for there to be behavior, right? We got to respond to something. Again, calling back to our learning chapter here. And environments can affect heritability. So I've already given you the example of nutrition and height, right? But also we know, for example, intellectual stimulation. So even something just like having books available in the house is related to, future ability to do well in school, but it's also related to IQ, which is supposed to be stable. So genetic expression and social environment. So again, we use height, right? You being really short or really tall might lead you to be teased, and that can influence you psychologically. Choice of environment is also considered to be similar to, are related to genetic tendencies, right? So if you are one of those sensation-seeking people, you might seek out, legal but dangerous things like skydiving, but you also might seek out, criminal activities. And the same environment can affect different individuals in different ways. So responses to stressful or boring experiences, some of us will just ignore it. Some of us will eat, right? Some will take up alcohol. Some will take up a hobby, right? And all those things, I'm sure, happens to everyone in this class in different ways in quarantine, right? And as I've mentioned before, genes are expressed in an environment. All right, so now we're going to switch gears from behavioral genetics over to evolutionary personality psychology. So it attempts to explain how patterns of behavior that characterize all humans originated in the survival value of these characteristics. So it's basically like the reason we have these personality traits is because somehow they were adaptive at some point in our history. So you're applying evolutionary theory, not to just humans, but to human behavior in particular. And characteristics with more survival value would be more likely to appear in subsequent generations. But remember from way back at the beginning of the semester when we talked about culture and we watched the clip from Idiocracy, right? That is not necessarily always true. There are some traits that are not adaptive that have just stuck around. Our appendix, right? Like you kind of don't need it and you kind of don't notice it until it explodes and almost kills you, right? Things like sensitivity to cancer. Why haven't we bred that out of ourselves yet, right? And giant pandas. I had a friend who was an EES major who always railed about pandas. He's like, I don't know why we're trying to kill why we're trying to keep pandas alive when they just like can't keep themselves alive. So like A, they're really bad at mating, and B, they actually have a carnivore digestive system, but they eat all bamboo, right? So like it seems like that should have made there no pandas, right? But they somehow survived. And what we do here is we try to identify common behavior patterns and then determine how that behavior was adaptive. So the biggest thing you'll hear evolutionary psychologists talk about is sexual differences in mating behavior. And this is sex as in gender, I mean, the biological aspect of gender. And so this is, I'm just going to present it as they present it. But this is where a lot of feminists like myself struggle with evolutionary theory. So mate selection is what one looks for in the opposite sex. So already we're very heteronormative, right? So women place higher value, or the idea is that men place higher value on physical attractiveness and prefer younger mates. Men select widely. They try to get a sperm to an egg at every opportunity. And women place higher value on economic security and prefer older mates. So women select wisely. They must be careful. Both want the highest likelihood of healthy offspring who will survive and reproduce, passing down their traits. And the difference is in how this goal is pursued and achieved. Female attractiveness signals youth and physical health and ability to have children. Males need to provide economic resources and appropriate attitudes to support a family. Now, mating strategies are how one handles heterosexual relationships. So there are differences that do come up consistently in literature between women and men. The desired number of sexual partners tends to be higher for men, faithfulness to partner, selectivity of partners, and the experience of sexual jealousy. So men report that they would be more upset at sexual infidelity and women at emotional infidelity. However, 55% of men think that they would be more upset by imagining their partner falling in love with someone else than by imagining their partner in different sexual positions with someone else, versus 88% of females, but it's still more than half of men, right? So again, poking some holes in this. There are different factors that affect reproductive success. So again, the idea is that men want to have as many kids as possible and not waste time taking care of kids that are not their own. I think of the song Gold Digger, right? And then women want to find a man to help support them and the children. Then we have the most Freudian part of evolutionary theory, and that is the sexy son hypothesis. So this explains an alternative mating strategy for women where they might mate with an unattractive but unstable male who will produce sexier sons who will be more likely to reproduce. A, creepy. B, sounds like Freud's ideas about how to resolve penis envy to me, right? There are some complications. Women who are too thin cannot bear children. In fact, this is one of the hallmarks of anorexia nervosa, is that if you're not on the pill, you will actually stop menstruating, right? If you're not menstruating, if you're not having a cycle, you're not producing an egg, you can't have a kid, right? And the ideal for women in our society is thin, right? Attention is influenced by more than physical characteristics and attraction, right? We definitely know that we look for things like intelligence, humor, kindness. Male physical attractiveness is also more important for women than it should be, according to this theory, right? And then this is a line I can still hear Newberry saying, shouldn't men want to go along with the women's program, right? Evolutionary psychology basically says men are inclined to act like jackasses, but they should want to do or be what women want them to do, or they won't be allowed to pass on their genes because the women won't select them. If men are in the hospital or the morgue or rejected because they're players or too dangerous, they won't be successful at passing down their genes. Now, evolutionary psych focuses on general human nature, not individual differences. So it kind of ignores the fact that we do have individual differences. They try to come up with some evolutionary reasons for individual differences, that diversity is needed for viability, that different traits and behaviors are adaptive in different situations. So for example, neuroticism and anxiety are actually really adaptive in dangerous situations. I treated a National Guardsman while I was at the VA who was being redeployed. And he was like, I don't want you to take away my PTSD symptoms because they keep me alive over there. And I was like, of course they do. Come back when, you come back from being deployed. Versus if you're in a non-threatening situation, they become maladaptive, right? openness to experience might be great if we're thinking about artistic things, but might be pretty bad if it gets you hooked on, destructive, illegal substances. Behavioral patterns evolve as reactions to particular environmental experiences. So different environments will result in different behavioral patterns or traits. There might be several possible behavioral strategies that have evolved, and each individual has only one of these. And some behaviors may be frequency dependent. They adjust according to how common they are. Some behaviors are adaptive only as long as only a few people do them. For example, being a criminal, right? If we were all criminals, there almost like wouldn't be being a criminal, if that makes sense, and we would be able to profit. And then human nature is flexible, is another idea here, which, yeah, definitely, right? So here now becomes another question we ask ourselves, which is, will biology replace psychology, right? Will we start to focus entirely on biopsychology, neuropsychology, and ignore things like theoretical personality psychology? So this idea is sometimes called biological reductionism, which is the idea that everything about the mind can be reduced to biology. And we honestly don't know enough about biology yet for this to be possible. And biology leaves out most of psychology and does not ask important psychological questions like, what are people thinking? How are people influenced by the environment? Including how are people influenced by other people, right? So these become very important things for us to ponder. So I actually got through that in even less than a class, so extra glad I decided to give you Wednesday off. I think I talk faster when there's not people in front of me, because I've definitely had times where this took me into the second day. So as a reminder, again, for anyone who might have signed on late, yeah, this is all kind of like a sci-fi movie, Amanda, that's very true. We have class on Monday. We'll do the discussion for this chapter on Monday. So I think on your syllabus it's set for Wednesday. We're bumping that up to Monday. Again, I'm going to send you an email about this. Wednesday, the day after the election, you do not have class. And then Friday, you have exam 3. And then the following week, we are going to start our simulation. So when I send the email about class change, I will also send you all the questionnaire about what sort of role you might want to play in that. So I'll stick around for anyone who has questions, but otherwise have a safe and fun Halloween weekend.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Have a great weekend, guys.
Marvin, for another moment. During this class, I had become obsessed with this dog, and I'm really close to like figuring out how I can adopt him. Straight up.
Add to your menagerie. Add to your menagerie. He is really, really cute.
Very sweet. All right, bye, friends.
I signed on a little late. I had a doctor's appointment that ran long. Is there anything in the chat that was said during the lecture that when I watch it back, I'm gonna need to know?
No, because I read everything. So the only thing you really need to know is that no class next Wednesday. Huzzah! And do the readings for Monday.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Haley, do you have any questions for me? All right, Debbie, we can start talking. Sometimes people just don't sign off right away. So
Yeah.
All right, let me see. I think I should have access to your stuff on WebAdvisor, but let me see if that's actually the case.
I still have to send you the sheet thing, words.
The sheet thing.
Where is that? Oh yeah, the